The third element of Henry Clay's American system relates to another basic necessity for an industrial economy to develop. You know, before you can have an industrial revolution, you really have to have what some economists call a transportation revolution. You have to be able to deliver goods from one part of the country to another. You have to be able to transport raw materials from wherever, from farm or mine or forest or wherever, to the factory, and then you have to be able to deliver from the factory to the consumers. Now, in early America, in the colonial days, we really didn't have any form of transportation. So most production, there were people in cities that manufactured things. You had millwrights in cities building lumber and so forth for use of building houses. And you had carpenters, you had millers milling grain into flour to make bread. You know, but it could only serve a local market because you don't have any way to transport. So all production had to be local. You'd get your raw materials from the locality and you'd sell to a local market. You had your customers in the local market. And if there was a raw material that you needed and you don't have it in the local market, it's not available in the local market for some reason, you don't have that manufacturing. It's that simple. You can only manufacture what you can get locally and what you can sell locally, because you have to sort of use local transportation. Well, we're going to start to have, even back in the 1790s, we're going to start to have what we call a transportation revolution. And the transportation revolution is going to start with some technological improvements, even though, I don't know, technology sounds like a pretty advanced word for what's happening, but at a very low level, this is technology. There are some innovations, some breakthroughs that are going to permit us to have a transportation revolution. Sort of the first stage of this was the building of roads. You know, in the early days, people traveled by wagon or horse-drawn carriages or whatever, but they just would sort of go through the countryside wherever there was a place to go. And there would be kind of some roads would get kind of tramped down by a lot of cars or a lot of wagons being carried, a lot of coaches being carried, a lot of people riding horseback. And they'd all sort of go the same place that got worked out, and there'd be sort of a road. But it would just be sort of whatever was there. It was just sort of whatever nature provided. In the 1790s, some entrepreneurs started building roads as actual built structures. There were sort of two technologies that do that. One was using planks, so they would be called plank roads. That is, you know, you'd cut down a tree, you'd plane it into a plank, a wood board of some kind, and then you'd lay the boards in a row and line them up and make it into a road, made it out of wooden planks. The other was called macadam. I'll put that into words for you. Macadam was like gravel. But again, instead of it just being whatever was there naturally, now some entrepreneur comes out and actually builds by laying level gravel in certain layers, and it's a complicated technology. Well, it's complicated for that time, but you'd lay it out and you'd make an actual macadam road. So now there are roads that people can use that are formally built and are designed to be used to improve transportation. These are mostly built by private companies. They hope to make a profit by charging tolls. These are all toll road businesses, and that's the idea. I mean, that's why somebody invests in this. They build this road. They say people will use this because it's better than just whatever the natural road is, and I'll make money. Most of those failed. This was the technology wasn't very good. Those roads really didn't work that well. When it rained, they'd all sort of go away, or the wood wouldn't hold together, or macadam would run out. It's just, they didn't do very well, and the businesses were not very successful. But it's a step, it's an effort, and it's a realization by people that if we're going to have a successful modern country with a real industrial base and producing stuff for ourselves instead of just being a bunch of a nation of farmers. We're going to have some real industrial activity here. We have to have transportation. That's the first step. Didn't work very well, but at least people are trying to come up with some way to transport goods across a distance. That's sort of the first phase of what I would call the transportation revolution. A second phase, a second step, was building canals. People knew how to build canals forever. I mean, the Romans had built canals back in the days of the Roman Empire, and people had known that technology. And there were some canals in the United States in colonial time. People knew how to build canals, and they would build them. But the canals in the United States, as of, say, the War of 1812, the time that we're using as sort of the turnaround and we're going to start industrializing in this country, the canals were pretty small and didn't go very far and didn't do very much business, and they weren't that big a deal. But in 1816, this is the sort of the starting year. This is the year of the Tariff Act. This is the year of the Second Bank. In 1816, the state of New York started to build the Erie Canal. You'll have to look at a map to see it. It runs basically from Albany, New York, over to Lake Erie near Buffalo. It goes across the state of New York. Now see, I've talked about how Americans couldn't settle in the West until we got New Orleans, because there's mountains in between, and you can't cross the mountains commercially. And so that had always meant that all of our Western development had to focus on the rivers that go down to the Ohio River, to the Mississippi, and down to New Orleans. That's how we were settling the West. People were going there, they were taking their goods down the rivers. And so we've had what I sometimes call the river cities have been developing. There's New Orleans at the end, of course, but there's cities along the rivers like St. Louis, Cincinnati, Louisville, Pittsburgh at the very beginning of the Ohio River. Those cities are developing and they're expanding as Americans start to settle the West, and they take their goods to the cities where there's merchants there, and it comes on down to New Orleans. And that's been going on. But what the state of New York did was to build a canal, the Erie Canal, that went over the mountains. It crossed the mountains. Crossed at a low level so that you could build a canal. You know how a canal works. You have locks that carry it up several steps, and then you have it, and then it goes down on the other side. And they built that. The technology was there. And the Erie Canal was a marvelous success. Traffic on the Erie Canal was just spectacular. There's just so much goods that the area around it just bloomed. Cities that hadn't even existed before suddenly became major cities. Albany prospered. But Albany had already been there. Albany is on the Hudson River at one end of the canal. So what you do is you go up the river to Albany, and you can sail up to Albany. And then you put the stuff at Albany, you put the stuff into barges to take through the canal. And then along the way, there's the city of Rochester. Rochester just, boom, became like the 10th largest city in the country. It didn't even exist in 1816. By 1825, it's like the 10th largest city in the country. At the other end of the canal is Buffalo, New York, which also just, boom, just took off. And there's just so much transportation along the canal. Much of upstate New York that had not been settled before because you couldn't get your stuff out. Now you can use the canal, all along the canal, many miles on either side of it. There's just an explosion of settlement. People are settling there. The population is increasing drastically. Agricultural production is increasing. But then there's all of this urban activity in Rochester, and at one end, Rochester in the middle, Albany at the other end. And of course from Albany, it just goes down to New York City. New York City has all of this trade, And now, see, you can go to New York. You don't have to go to New Orleans. You can take your goods across the mountains through the Erie Canal, and this is just an amazing development. It leads to amazing economic growth for the state of New York. The state built it. This was built by the state of New York. The state of New York made a ton of money off of the Erie Canal. It was a great success, and the state is just enormously prosperous because of all of this traffic, all of these farmers out there. And then there's other cities that are going to start going along the Great Lakes. So we have what I call the lake cities as opposed to the river cities. The river cities are sort of on the southern end. Up there, there's cities like starting with Buffalo, and then Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, and not until the 1830s, but the greatest of them all, Chicago. All of these lake cities. And what you can do is you ship through the Great Lakes. You go to Buffalo, put stuff onto the Erie Canal, and there's just all of this economic activity, all of this trade going back and forth. And the Erie Canal is an enormous success. Many other states got into the business of building canals. None of them was as successful as the Erie Canal. As a matter of fact, the state of Ohio built a whole bunch of canals. They saw the Erie Canal and they went crazy, let's all build canals. And none of them were as profitable or as successful as the Erie Canal. And the state of Ohio went bankrupt because of all of its failed canals. The state of Illinois built a canal running from Chicago, Lake Michigan, down to the Mississippi River, or actually to the Illinois River, and then the Illinois is a tributary of the Mississippi. And so they built a canal there, hoping to have a lot of trade. It didn't work out, but and the state of Illinois declared bankruptcy. But there's this big emphasis on building canals, and it's a huge project as everybody's trying to catch up to the Erie Canal and to New York City. So that's sort of the second phase. Now, there's a third phase that sort of overlaps, and it relates to the traditional rivers, which we've always been using. The problem with rivers is that they only go one way, and you can go down the Maumee River to the Ohio, down the Ohio to Mississippi, to the Mississippi River, and then down the Mississippi to New Orleans. But then how do you get back? Well, the only way to get back is to walk. So what farmers would do is build a raft, put their crop on it, float it down the rivers to New Orleans, break up the raft, sell it for scrap wood, and then walk home. I mean, they'd raise their product during the summer. At the end of the fall, they'd carry it down to New Orleans, and then in the winter, they'd spend the whole winter walking back home to be there in spring to plant the next year's crop. But the steam engine has been invented, and people started figuring out ways to use steam engines on boats. And it took a little while. The first steamboats were not particularly successful. There were some disasters. Some of the boats would explode. Steam engines are, if you don't build them right or run them right, they can cause you a lot of problems. But we finally figured out how to use steamboats. So, and this took a little while. The first steamboat runs actually in 1811 on the Mississippi, or actually on the Ohio River. Well, no, the first one was on the Hudson River in New York, but the big place for steamboats was the Ohio, Mississippi, and then even up the Missouri River. So now, although the lake cities are prospering because they can ship things via the Great Lakes to Buffalo, and from there by the Erie Canal to Albany and then to New York, the river cities still had a little bit of a revival because of the steamboat. So the steamboat is going to provide transportation. And river cities, although they were usually secondary to the lake cities, the lake cities kind of had an edge on them. But cities like what I call the river cities, like Louisville and Cincinnati and St. Louis, Pittsburgh, New Orleans itself, cities along the Mississippi, they could come back by the use of steamboats. So all of this is leading to a lot of activity, a lot of economic development. The cities along the way, the cities on the canals, the cities on the rivers, they all boomed in the 20s and so forth. The American economy is really taking off. We're industrializing. There's a lot of industrial growth. There's a lot of urban growth. We still remained an urban nation, a rural nation. We still remain a nation of small farmers. But small farmers are the people who have the products that are moved on all of these transportation innovations. So the American economy is just going off. Now there will be sort of a fourth stage of transportation that's going to be the ultimate. But it's going to be a little bit later than I'm going to talk about today, so I won't talk about it. I'll just mention it now, because the technology wasn't quite there in the 1820s, and I'm going to stop in the 1820s. But that's, of course, being the ultimate in transportation. To this day, railroads. Railroads are going to start operating around 1828. They're going to be very primitive, but eventually the railroad is going to be the supreme form of transportation. It's the ultimate form of transportation, as of the 1830s, as of today. So we've got all of these transportation innovations. And the question is about them. Everybody's in favor of this. Everybody's agreed on this. These were called internal improvements. Internal improvements. But the question is, who should build them? Now, I've mentioned a couple already. One was the roads, which started out as private businesses, were not successful. But some canals were built by private entrepreneurs, and railroads are going to be built by private entrepreneurs. Steam engines were run by private businesses. They owned a boat. So one option was to use the private enterprise system. Another option, which was used in the Erie Canal, was to have the state government build it. And this, as I mentioned, many states got into the business of canals. New York did so successfully. Ohio and Illinois and a couple of other states did so much less successfully, failed. But at least an option was to have the state build it. But a third option was to have the federal government build it. So the federal government is going to get into this business. And it's going to be building a road. The federal government built a road, the national road. The federal government was an investor in a canal, the canal that ran from Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh. What is it? I forgot the name of it. But there's a canal that was built there to cross the mountains in another place. And the federal government was a partner in that with a couple of states. And so that's the third option. But what Henry Clay suggests is, as part of his whole American system, that the federal government should be responsible for internal improvements. That not to be, and it's not one or the other, you can have all three, and we did have all three. But he's saying that one of the things that the federal government needs to do as part of its whole program of promoting economic growth, and that's what the American system is about, that's what Henry Clay is about, that's what the new Republican Party is about, is to have the federal government be actively involved in building internal improvements. So that's Clay's program. There are three components: tariffs, the second bank of the United States, and internal improvements at federal expense. And this is where the Republican Party is as of the 1820s, and the American economy is benefiting from all of these innovations. We'll talk later about where we go from there.